Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cup Interviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I will be your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, and I'm joined today by a very interesting guest, a little out of our usual wheelhouse where we predominantly cover live theatre, but we have a filmmaker with us today who has just released her first feature film, Fortescue, which has some interesting theatrical components to it that made it worth bringing her onto the show to talk about this, which I think is really interesting. So, Rebeccah Love, thank you for being on the show. Welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, we're so happy to have you. We got to begin with our usual icebreaker question. What is in your cup today?
I just have a glass of water. I'm not sure if you can see it properly,
Yeah,
but
it's blurry
it's a little
because
blurry,
of
but
the background filter you have, but I believe you that it's water. So you don't need
great.
to do anything excessive to prove it. Right now, I'm actually drinking orange pico tea, which I'm drinking in the cup. Hey, that's the show you're listening to
Okay.
right now. Welcome onto the show. It's rare that we have a filmmaker on the show, and we're so happy to have you. Why don't you just start by telling us a little about yourself, maybe how you first got into filmmaking, some relevant training, influences, experiences, projects. The floor is yours to describe your identity as an artist, however you please.
That's awesome. My name is Rebeccah Love. I'm a disabled filmmaker based in Toronto. My pronouns are she, her. I grew up in Toronto. I started off in theater. I did a lot of Sears Drama Fest when I was in high school, doing a lot of sort of yearly theatrical productions. And I taught theater at a summer arts camp. Yeah, I've always been a big fan of theater. That's how I got my start. But when I was about 20, I decided that I wanted to go to film school. I've always loved film as well. I can't really articulate why I ended up choosing film over theater, but theater has definitely played an enormous role in my cinematic productions. There's always a little bit of theater influence in what's going on in my stories. Yeah, so I went to TMU for my BFA, and then I did an MFA at the University of Guelph in creative writing. I've written, directed, and produced 8 shorts, and Fortescue is my very first feature-length film. I live with a few different disabilities, but the big sort of disease that I focus on most often in my filmmaking is bipolar disorder. I live with bipolar 1. I haven't had a psychotic episode in 12 years, but I'm fascinated by psychosis. And as we'll dive into this conversation, I'm sure I'm most interested in the connection between psychosis and theater because I
Mhm.
see some parallels there, and I sort of
Yes,
I play with that in my films.
that's something you can be sure we're definitely going to talk about because in
Okay.
this film in particular, it is something that I think is framed very interestingly and potently. Because you had this background in theater before you made your way into film as your primary vocation, do you still have ties to the theater community in Toronto or elsewhere, or has it really had to take the back burner in your life while you get out on your film shoots?
So I love going out to see theater, but I do not really participate actively in the world of theater. I mean, in my MFA class, I took a dramatic writing
Mhm.
course where I learned a lot about theater and I wrote for theater. I guess that's the last time I wrote for theater was in my MFA. But the dramatic writing course sort of was about theater as well as filmmaking. So I have this great love for theater, but my only engagement with theater is through my films.
Mhm.
So I love playing with metatheater. I love playing with the idea of theatrical performance, and I'm always knitting it back into this idea of insanity. And just to be clear, insanity is not the word you're supposed to use anymore to describe mental breakdowns. You're supposed to use the word psychosis. But I, as a member of the community
Mhm.
who, is maybe allowed a few more freedoms in the way we describe the condition and the symptoms, I just prefer the word insanity. So
Yeah.
anyways, so theater, yeah, I don't really engage with theater outside of my narratives, which are cinematic.
Yeah, that's very valid. And not to press the theater point at all. It's more just that's our brand. So I feel like I have
Oh
to
yeah, come on, get
a
it.
little bit. So let's get into the movie a bit. I do want to have a bit of a separation between like a pre-spoiler and a post-spoiler
Okay.
section because I do think right now it's touring at various festivals and a lot of people will hopefully get a chance to see it, but I don't want people to just shut this off and not listen because we say there's going to be spoilers. So we'll
Okay.
talk non-spoiler and then there'll be a clear demarcation at
Love
which
it.
point.
Love it.
So
very thoughtful.
In the interest of non-spoiler, why don't you just begin by telling our listeners what the film is about?
Fortescue is a film about female friendship. It's a film about mental health. It's a film about misogyny, the male gaze, the female gaze. It's a story about three friends who are up at a cottage and who are putting on a play, Rapunzel, for the local cottagers. Yeah, that's what I'll say about Fortescue.
Yeah, no, it's very good. It's that you really give a lot of like juicy nuggets of things that people can get excited about without spoiling exactly what happens in it. So very efficient non-spoiler description. I'm sure you've practiced it many times, put it in many grant applications. So you're an old hat pro at this point. I want to flip the script in how these interviews are often done a little bit, because I think there's a very common interview question that you probably get a lot, that where did the idea or inspiration from this film come from? And maybe you've even hinted at some of that already. But I want to ask a variation on this question, if you'll indulge me, because I think with any big or serious project like this, I would argue that there are really two moments of inception that I would like you to reflect on both of. One of them is, what was the moment when the premise metastasized in your brain as an actual project? Not simply a cluster of themes like you just outlined, things that you're interested or images, ideas that you have in your head that you want to explore, but what was the moment when the actual story became apparent to you as something you not only could tell, but wanted to tell? That's the first one. And then there's a second, but I'll let you answer that first.
That's a beautiful question. And I can tell you're a person who thinks deeply about stories and ideas, because I don't often get this kind of question. It's a hard thing to measure or calculate or sort of account for, because so much of my storytelling happens in these loose daydreams while I'm waiting for a streetcar, while I'm waiting for water to boil, while I'm in the shower, and little bits and pieces will come in different moments. By the time I wrote my application for the Canada Council for the Arts, enough of these little pieces had come together in some kind of a story, but it's a very loose outline. And that would have been in 2019, I guess. And then a lot of the actual story comes out in the writing, because I don't necessarily have all the pieces together when I'm writing my grant application. It's once I get the money to write the script, and once I sit down at my desk. I received my grant right when COVID hit. So COVID hit on the 15th of March 2020, and maybe like the next day or 2 days later, I received my grant money.
Now go make a movie right now.
Go make a movie right now. Well, not to make the movie, just to write the script.
Oh, just to write. Okay, so that wasn't them telling you in the middle of a pandemic to go out and shoot something.
No, they're just giving me permission basically to write my story.
Okay,
the timing was sort of perfect because I had no distractions. I couldn't go hang out with my friends. I had stopped work. I was given this period of a couple months to just live in my imagination, live with my thoughts, live with my daydreams, go on long walks, and just sort of sort out the story in my mind. So to answer your question, I don't have like a clear date. I don't.
That's fine. And I'm not even asking about the date specifically, more just do you recall how this emerged as a potential project for you?
Sure. It sort of came in pieces, and I guess all came together once I actually sat down at my desk and started really trying to flesh out the narrative. The loose story would have arrived in my daydreams sometime in 2019. Yeah.
Interesting. You received that grant right when the pandemic started. Were you still in post-production on your earlier short film Parlor Palm at that point?
So at that point, Parlor Palm would have been in post-production. It would have been in post-production. Yeah, it would have been. It's so hard for me to put the pieces together. That whole period of time, I'm sure for everyone is a little bit foggy. It's sort of trying to remember where we were all at when the pandemic hit. But Parlor Palm would have been in post-production, and Parlor Palm is also, the themes carry over. Parlor Palm is also about performance and insanity and
the theatrical frame.
The proscenium, yes. There's definitely like a lot of theater happening in Parlor.
Yeah, of course. And if it seems like I have a better memory of your own career arc than you do, it's actually because you and I met in like September, October of 2019, if you recall, and
Right.
you were
Right.
just about to go into shooting Parlor Palm, and then
Okay.
recalling that timeline in relation to when the pandemic happened, I'm like, well, yeah, you must have been either just finishing post or maybe just going into post at that point. So
Oh, interesting. Well, I'm grateful for your memory because you're helping me remember. It would have been around, around
yeah.
that time that we shot, and we would have been in post in 2020. Yeah.
Right. So that's my first version of this kind of inception point question. Usually I would expect the order to be different, but I feel like your answer to the second one is going to precede what you just described with the first one. So if that previous question was about the moment that it metastasized as a project,
Right.
what was the moment when you decided that this was going to be your next project, that you wanted to spend the next year or two or however many of your life working on telling this story specifically and making it a reality?
Oh boy, I don't think I can even answer that question because it again, like you get little pieces of everything.
Mhm.
This film I've been working on for 5 years now. When I first decided I was making this movie, I had no idea what was in store. I had no idea it would take this long. I had no like you just kind of the feature length film is sort of something that you dream about when you're in film school. Not exactly sure if you'll ever make it to that point, but I can't quite remember deciding. I don't think you're ever really deciding anything. You're hoping that you're going to get your grant money, and then you get your grant money, and then you hope that you'll find the rest of the funding because the grant isn't covering all the costs of producing a film. A film is incredibly expensive to make, and you're just kind of hoping that things work out. I'm not sure if I've ever been the kind of confident person to say, yes, this is definitely happening. You're sort of taking these numerous leaps of faith
Mhm.
where you're putting your grant application out there and you're like, I hope they choose me and I hope they give me the money. And then you get the money, you're like, I hope I can find the rest of the money. And you're just kind of hoping and waiting for results. And I guess once I had my full funding confirmed, but even after that, you're still fundraising after that. You never quite have enough money. So, anyways, I'm not sure if I ever decided one day this was going to happen. Like I'm really grateful it did happen. And all of the pieces come in stages, like it doesn't all kind of come at once where you're like, I have my full plan and it's going to happen. It's like one day you're cooking rice and you're like, maybe I should make a movie in Halliburton. And like 3 weeks later, you're like, okay, well, maybe I should put this grant application together. And then a year and a half later, you're like, okay, I've got some funding. Maybe I should figure out how, like, it's sort of all these little pieces and not one sort of like
Yeah.
complete vision and plan kind of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I guess at one point, though, eventually in this process, once you got the grant and then you raised more funds, and eventually you're casting actors, hiring crew, scouting locations,
Right.
there must have, I guess, by that point, been this moment of, yes, we are making a movie. This is happening. This
So
train can't stop at this point.
yeah, I think we put down some money on some accommodations
Hmm.
to house our crew.
Right.
And once that money was down, it was a huge chunk of money too. It's like a big chunk of money. It's like, okay, now we know this is happening. We can't go back. We can't get this money back. Maybe there's
Yeah.
some way to get the money back, but it's like that was the big first, like, okay, this is gonna happen. It's gonna
Mhm.
happen.
That's
Yeah.
nice. And that feels like such a benign or prosaic moment of just transferring funds and securing space. But that, if you think about the artistic journey that you've spent hypothesizing about the film you might make,
Mm.
it's interesting to pinpoint that as the moment that I am making a movie.
That's it. That's it. I
Yeah.
mean, I guess when you're in conversation with actors, you don't want to offer roles that you can't, where your promise means nothing. So I can't quite remember when we put down the money first, and then
Mhm.
casting and contracts for actors came out a couple months after that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a strange
Mhm.
sort of cluster of events that allow for a film to happen. And sometimes films don't happen, right?
Right.
Sometimes, people put the money down and there's some climate situation that ruins a film shoot or COVID or,
Yeah.
even once you put that money down, it's still not a sure thing. You're still kind of praying a lot.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to hear kind of this whole sequence, and you miraculously made the movie happen, which is no small feat. Can we talk about the title a bit? What is the significance of it, which is also a setting, but you
So
could have called the movie anything.
Fortescue is the name of the lake
Mhm.
that all these people are cottaging on. It is a lake, it's a real lake in Halliburton, and it comes from the French forte, strong, and escu, which is shield. And I don't push this too hard, on anyone, but in my interpretation of those words as they relate to the story, and again, I don't want to be revealing too many
Sure.
spoilers here,
Mhm.
but I'll try to describe this in sort of loose terms. The story suggests three different responses to mental health crises. One is to leave, one is to be abusive and violent, and the other is to protect.
Mhm.
And again, we're not sharing spoilers in this
Yeah,
section or
but
anything.
having seen the movie, I can exactly see how that
Right,
maps onto certain characters and
right,
moments and scenes.
right.
Yeah.
And there's one character who is the strong shield.
Mhm.
And I think as women, we're taught that our man is going to be our strong shield. That's what
Mhm.
little girls are taught from the beginning of consuming stories. We're taught that our husbands, our boyfriends, our male partners are going to be our rock, our strong
Mhm.
shield. And it's just not always the case. Sometimes someone else might be your strong shield. Someone
Mhm.
else might play that role. And it sort of dives into these sort of notions of like relationship anarchy, like love, like what kind of love is important, what kind of love should we be celebrating. And again, women, I think, at least when I was a young girl, I consumed so many stories about romantic love being the most important kind of love and the
Mhm.
only really kind of love that's really important. So Fortescue is meant to kind of explore, well, what other kinds of love can be
Mhm.
beautiful and important. So Fortescue, the strong shield, is like reminding us that role can be played by lots of different kinds of people.
Yeah. And did you actually film on location at that very lake?
Yes, we did.
I have to ask, did you choose that as your filming location because you had this really meaningful title that you wanted it to be about? Or did you have that location like, that'd be a good title for my movie? It's actually kind of about what this is about. Interesting.
Yeah, we chose the location first.
Mhm.
And we had a long conversation about the title. There were a few different suggestions for title, but
You
yeah,
can't tease me with that without telling me what some of them were.
well, I can't even remember. I can't even remember that. None of them were very good. They were all
Okay.
forgettable and not very interesting. But Fortescue, yeah, it just sort of worked out the
Mhm.
the way the title plays it. But it's not very obvious, and it's not something that I really like talk about a
Yeah.
lot. But I'm grateful for the question and the opportunity to be able to share
Mhm.
my thoughts on the title. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not even like said aloud, like maybe more than twice in the movie itself. So it's like one that you leave the movie kind of pondering about it. Maybe you didn't even catch that that was the actual setting of it. And you're like, "Ooh, what does this mean?" Maybe I'm going to Google some etymology, and oh, well, that's interesting. What could that mean? But I don't know. We have fun with titles. I'm curious. There's a term that has sort of fallen out of fashion lately, but for a while there, it was sort of a big buzzword in indie filmmaking, and that's mumblecore. I don't know if that's a
Mm.
term you think about in relation to your own work? Do you identify with it as a genre or a movement?
Y- Yeah, mumblecore is something that I have thought about. I'm not sure if my films perfectly align with the definition of mumblecore, the history of mumblecore. There's like an element of mumblecore that does surface in my stories, millennial
Mhm.
young millennials talking about their love lives. There's an element of that that surfaces, but I also think that there are parts of my films that are much more stylized
Mhm.
and are a little bit more aligned with the storytelling of like maybe Charlie Kaufman or
Mhm.
someone who's playing a little bit more with ideas of metatheater and performance, which is not a key sort of aspect of
Right,
mumblecore.
which is usually like all about the kind of stark, unvarnished realism. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, my films don't there's some elements that might fit into that world, but not not a perfect fit. I also think about Noah Baumbach a little bit
Yeah.
sometimes in some of the conversations that with like a certain kind of person at a dinner party, you know? I think of like that dinner there are a couple dinner parties in Francis Ha where I'm like, "Oh
Yeah.
yeah, I can kind of feel that energy," but it's not quite a Noah Baumbach film because he's very funny and I'm not very funny, like my writing.
Give yourself some credit.
Well, I like people aren't laughing that much
Sure.
in my film. It's not like a comedy really. Like Noah Baumbach films are very clever and witty and funny, and that's not how I identify as a writer.
It's interesting you bring up Noah Baumbach and I think Greta Gerwig also, and obviously they're coupled together. And I feel like they're often both mentioned in the conversation around Mumblecore
Yeah,
as that
yeah,
moment. And yet, if you think about the work they're doing now, how you go from something like Frances Ha and Lady Bird to Barbie, like
yeah.
it's complete. The shift towards stylization has done a complete 180. I wonder to what extent that aesthetic or that movement is often treated as like a low budget stepping stone toward bigger and better things. And maybe that's why it's kind of fallen out of fashion a little bit as its most vocal proponents have moved on to larger projects.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting theory. I don't know. Like I don't hear that term thrown around as much. I think that
Mhm.
it had its moment like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, especially in New York City, all these New York filmmakers. But there was a time where I was watching more mumblecore films and
Mhm.
trying to see if there were connections in my own work. You know, you had asked about influences and I maybe
Mhm.
we're gonna get into this, but it's like
Yeah, please.
it's actually sort of hard for me to find influences to talk about. Like I love Michel Gondry, I love Guy Maddin,
Mhm.
I love Jean-Marc Vallée. There are lots of filmmakers I adore, but like I don't see a lot of filmmakers making the kinds of films that I make. Like I don't know how to like that makes it sounds kind of boastful. Like one of my guy friends asked me a couple years ago. He was like, "Rebecca, who are your influences?" And I'm like, I'm just influenced by my old work. Like I'm just like building off of my old work. I'm not really like I don't consume a lot of film. That's the thing that's sort of strange about me. I really don't watch too many films in a year. Like I love film. I love going to movie theater. For me, cinema is a holy sacred experience. And I love going to the movie theater and watching on a big screen and not being distracted by my phone or the fridge and having this like religious experience with the audience in a world where nobody goes to church or mosque or synagogue. Like the theater, the movie theater is a place of spiritual revelation. It's a place of it's very holy, and that's how I like to consume films. But I obviously don't want to do that every week because it would become very expensive. And I also love the idea of savoring very few films in a year so that the experience is still very special and awe-inspiring. I feel like if I was consuming 2 or 3 movies a day,
Mhm.
somehow I would sort of normalize or, I wouldn't appreciate.
Yeah, desensitizing yourself to that religious type experience.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Mhm.
so of all the filmmakers I know, I'm I'm the least cinephilic, if that's a word. Like,
Yeah.
I don't participate in the culture in the way that many other filmmakers do, and I feel a little self-conscious about that, but I also just love that I'm kind of creating my own world and my own language and my own style that's not super heavily influenced by anyone else. So, yeah.
No, that's very neat. And I think what you're describing with that, the ritual of going to cinema is something holy. Like you're describing something theatrical. Yes, it's a flat screen and you're not sharing space with the actors that you see before you, but there is something to yeah, you put your phone away, you are watching it with other people, having reactions together, gasping and laughing at the same time and crying even. That, yeah, I think that it feels very consistent with your love of theater and what you get from theater that you find ways of getting from cinema as well.
Exactly that. And I think in an era where I feel like many people are isolated and a little, you know, lonely and spending too much time on their phones, there's something I love about getting together in a public space and just consuming. That's maybe not the right word. Savoring, appreciating, experiencing the magic of a story all together. I screened Fortescue at a senior's home
Mm.
on Sunday, and the average age would probably be 80 or 85. It was a group of maybe 50 or 60 or 70 people. And there's a song in my film. I'm not going to share what song it
I
is, but
think I know which one. Yeah.
yeah, it's sung out loud. And all of the seniors started singing along.
Hmm.
It was
Wow.
the sweetest, it was the most beautiful thing. So yeah, there's something I love about the dark space and the magical light
Mhm.
and just experiencing the the magic of a story in a special way. Like I don't
Mhm.
some people have movies on all the time, like on their winter holiday, they just have movies on in the background while they're eating or while they're hanging out with friends. I could never do that. I could never. For me, I want to really enjoy the ideas being presented, the colors and the richness of costuming and dialogue, and I want to really focus. I want to like really take in the thesis. I don't want to be distracted. I hate it when people talk at me while I'm trying to enjoy a movie,
But
especially if
isn't that part of the sharing the experience with other people, hearing their thoughts, letting them engage with you?
I'd rather have a long conversation after the movie's
Right.
over. That's a ritual I love. You know, you go to the movies on the car ride home, you
Mhm.
dissect. This is a sign of a good movie is
With
that
a
on
friend over a beverage.
yeah, you get into debates, you share your thoughts, like, it's such a rich experience, and that's what I strive for in my own film in Fortescue is like, "Oh, I want people to get into debates on the car ride home. I want them to, you know, have that back and forth, have that exchange and share their thoughts, and that's what I strive for in Fortescue, yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you for sharing all of that. It's a really interesting relationship you have to the medium you work in, and how you relate to it says a lot about the work that you're able to produce within it. I have one last pre-spoiler question before we can really dig into the weeds. And this is just something funny that I noticed rewatching the film this afternoon. On the end credits, you had a section for production and leadership mentorship, which
Right.
includes quite a few big names, actually, such as playwright Judith Thompson, director Mitchell Cushman, film director Adam Egoyan, to name only a few that jumped out at me. Care to comment on your relationship with these individuals and perhaps their impact on the finished film?
Sure. I didn't know what language to use to describe these people who really helped me either with creative elements or with leadership elements, which are sort of a little different. Judith Thompson was my thesis supervisor in my master's MFA in creative writing.
The
And
last time you wrote a play.
yes, yes. And I'm very, very grateful to I still call her Professor Thompson. I don't actually like referring to her as Judith because in my mind she's always my professor, and I still want to accord her that respect. So I will refer to her here as Professor Thompson. But no, she was so wonderful in helping me with my thesis screenplay. I really got a lot out of her course, and I think about her lessons often when I'm writing my screenplays. She encouraged us to record people talking,
Mhm.
do a voice recording of people talking
Without
to
them knowing?
well, with them knowing. So
Okay.
you just sit down with someone, you record them talking, and you can and then you transcribe their
Mhm.
speech and you really hear how people actually talk because people don't talk in full sentences. People talk in a very disjointed funny way. They repeat words. They throw in lots of ums and ahs. Anyways, loved learning from her because I incorporate a lot of those ideas in my own screenplay writing. You know, when you're writing words for an actor, don't aim for complete sentences because Thompson complete sentences. Anyways, so that's Judith Thompson, Professor Thompson. Mitchell Cushman and I met at theater art summer camp when I was like
Oh,
15,
wow.
and he quickly became like a mentor when I was 15 because he would give me all these titles of movies to watch.
Mhm.
He would get me to watch Wes Anderson movies and Fargo and like all Christopher Guest movies and he would get me books to read. So he just fed me this diet of wonderful stories and wonderful, exciting films and he was putting on plays and I'd go see them. And we collaborated together on a film. He did Lessons in Temperament. I did
Oh.
some work for him as an associate producer. But he remains like a wonderful mentor for me because he really understands running an operation, like the
Mhm.
practical realities of running an operation, while also understanding the creative problem solving and the story questions and costuming and working with actors and all the creative stuff. So he is one of my really, like, I really value his expertise and he's very generous in helping me. And then Adam Egoyan, like, I can't say I'm super close to Adam
Right.
Egoyan. I can't, like, I would not be able to say that, but he definitely has helped me with a few different. I try not to message him all the time because he's very busy,
Right.
but I have certain types of questions that I go to him for, and he has also been very, very generous in helping me and encouraging me. But I can't say like he's my best friend. I don't want to like.
But
Yeah,
he's a mentor. He's somebody who
yeah,
you
well,
can turn to, who gives you
yeah,
advice and
yeah,
inspires you.
yeah, yeah. I'm grateful for him. I'm grateful for him. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing all of that. Okay, I've kept you in anticipation long enough. I think it's time to get into the spoiler realm. So if anybody is intrigued by what we just talked about and really wants to see the movie without having any of it spoiled beyond the things that we've maybe already alluded to, before we get into it, where can people see the movie coming up? This episode is going to come out, I believe, on January 29th. So where's
Okay.
it going to be next?
Okay. So Fortescue is doing a national tour. We're going to Nanaimo on February 5th. It's going to screen through the Vancouver Island University. We're going to have a Vancouver screening at the Vancouver Cinematheque on February 15th at 1 p.m. We're going to go to Halifax for March 27th, and that's through the Dalhousie Arts Center. And then we're going to Charlottetown on March 29th and 30th, and that's the Tivoli Movie Theater in Charlottetown. And then we're coming back to Toronto in June for a screening in June, but I'm not at liberty to share any more details about the date or venue as it hasn't been announced yet. And I'm sworn to secrecy until that announcement.
Okay.
But it will be coming to Toronto for anyone who's listening from Toronto who wants to come watch. It will be in June.
Okay, so wow, you have really from sea to shining sea, jumping from
Yes,
west coast to east coast and then
we are
making it back
going
home in the middle. Hmm.
across the country. Yeah, it's going to be a wild time.
Okay, wow. So hopefully people in or around those cities are able to check it out as they will as they're frequenting those festivals. Once it does come back to Toronto, maybe it'll get a wider release and more people will be able to see it. But if this has gotten you excited about it, we're now going to get into some more juicy topics of conversation about the content and subject matter about the film itself. So, spoilers from here on out. Okay. I have like an idea of how I want to lead this conversation, but before I get into some of those points, I feel like there have been some moments where you want to say something, but then you hold back because you knew we weren't in spoiler town yet. So, has there been anything you've really wanted to say that you want to now just go back to
No, no,
before?
no. Go ahead. No, you take the lead and I'll follow. Yeah, I'll be excited to see what you ask here.
Yeah. So, okay, on my second rewatch of the film, because I knew it was for the purpose of having this conversation with you, I kind of made this like chart here of like 6 different sections of thoughts. And I guess I've kind of isolated what I feel like, I don't know if they're necessarily themes, some of them are definitely themes, but like 5 serious topics of conversation that I want to have about the film.
Okay.
And they all very much relate to each other. They're very intertwined. It's hard to even separate them into 5. And we don't need to separate our thoughts and say, oh, I can't talk about this one yet because that's going to come up later. Feel free to let them intermingle. But
Okay.
but the 5 topics I'll say at the outset, and this is the order that I kind of would like to talk about them in, is first and foremost theater and metatheatricality, because that is, again, our brand. So I feel like we should start with that.
Love it.
Then riffing off of that, the next one is the relationship between one's art and oneself.
Ah, yes. Yes, yes,
Mhm.
yes.
Then from there, I think we will go into topics around mental illness.
Love it.
And then from there, female sexuality.
Love
And
it.
then female friendship will be the last one. And I
Perfect.
think there's a very clear through line from how we get from one to the other, but I'm curious how we'll jump around between all of these.
Perfect.
Okay.
Wonderful.
So let's start with Metatheatricality. As you mentioned, that the three main characters are, we have a playwright as our sort of central protagonist, and her two actors, one of whom she's in a romantic relationship with, the other is a best friend. And they're putting on a show at this cottage near the what we could call the climax of the film. There is a 10-minute segment of them actually staging this theatrical performance for a
Yes.
small audience within the film. And this is what you kind of pitched me on as like, hey, this feels like something that you're probably interested in. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. So let's talk about the theatricality of this film. What gets you excited about that?
Well, I have done meta-theatrical
Mm-hmm.
shorts before. My thesis film in university was called Abacus, My Love, and that was meta-theatrical. And then Parlor Palm was meta-theatrical. And then Eve Parade was meta-theatrical. So I've now done 3 shorts about meta-theater. For me, and we're going to jump into mental illness right
Yeah,
away.
it has to happen. These are all
Yeah,
very
it's going to
intertwined.
happen.
You didn't just make 5 separate themes and be like, okay, this is chapter 1 about this, chapter 2 about that. No, they are
Yeah,
all intertwined completely.
very intertwined. So for me, what I love about meta-theater is it allows me to play around with the reality of insanity. The reality of insanity is that a person undergoing psychosis exists in a different world and is sort of performing in front of invisible audiences. Like often if you see someone who has schizophrenia or who has bipolar 1 and who's downtown, they might be homeless, they're wandering through the streets and they are talking in such an animated, expressive way, and you feel like they're talking to somebody who we can't see because we're not undergoing psychosis. But for the person who's suffering, and I've been through this experience myself because I live with bipolar 1, you have this internal world, this internal logic, you have these strange delusions and hallucinations, and you feel like you're communicating with an entity that is actually there. So when I touch on metatheater in my films, especially in these films that are dealing with psychosis, I'm able to access a part of a person undergoing psychosis and play with their internal world and play with their insanity in a way that showcases their internal logic and showcases the themes that they're wrestling with internally, and sort of dramatize these sort of invisible truths or invisible delusions in a way that the audience can sort of better understand what an ill person is dealing with. Does that make sense? It's sort of a complex.
No, I think it definitely makes sense, and why
Yeah,
how we forge this connection between the two ideas as what one can illuminate about the other and vice versa.
yeah. Meta theater can teach us about insanity. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's that's what I feel, and then insanity can teach us about theater.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's how I see things. Like when I was sick with bipolar psychosis, I haven't had psychosis in like 12 years, but when I was sick, I thought I was an actor, and I thought everyone around me was an actor, and I thought everyone around me was just performing a version of themselves. And like, I hate to quote Shakespeare here, but like, all the world's a stage. Like that's how I saw things when I was really sick.
Well, I never hate quoting Shakespeare, so if we could dig into that a little further, not just that one monologue from As You Like It, but I think Hamlet is the quintessential metatheatrical character. In fact, I pulled off my shelf the book Metatheater by Lionel Abel, where the term is actually coined. A very well thumbed book, so well thumbed it tore in half. But yeah, and it's a very interesting book. I think metatheater is a term that gets thrown around a lot by people who haven't read this book, and I'm not going to like police and say like, oh, if you read the book you know it's completely different, but the way we all use the term is actually not how he does in his coining of it. We kind of, I think, in most casual conversation, we tend to use metatheater as anything that's self-reflexive or theater about theater, play within a play usually is. And while all that stuff does come up in the book, what he kind of has in mind when he talks about metatheatricality is kind of a new stage as he charts it in the development of theater as a medium, as a genre, and
Mm,
specifically coming out of a period that no longer believes in the metaphysical potency of tragedy
mm,
because of various trends in philosophy and enlightenment, that he noticed a trend towards what he called this self-reflexivity of metatheater. And specifically, he was writing at a time when Martin Esslin was coining his term in a separate book, Theater of the Absurd, which touches on a lot of similar case studies. And there was kind of a mini feud between the two of them at the time, call it a pamphlet war, so to speak, of them both trying to get their term into circulation about, what are we going to call these new works that people want to get a handle of? Sorry, I'm going on a mini theater history
oh, I
lecture
love
here,
it.
but
I love it.
in Lionel Abel's framework of what he means by metatheater, he kind of thinks it does start in the Renaissance and then goes into the 20th century. And he points to a character like Hamlet as quintessentially metatheatrical, not just because he stages a play within the play, but there's a reason why there's a play within a play, is because it meditates on what the play is already about. And
Mm,
in his mind, for a play or character to be metatheatrical
mm,
is that they behave in a way as if they are characters in a play, that
mm,
they even if there was no audience perceiving them, and there is because they are in fact in a play, they would behave as if there was. And that's kind of the turn away from classical tragedy that he's sort of trying to chart throughout this. And I think that's very interesting in relation to what you're saying about psychosis, is that it is a relationship to yourself or your mind and your body that forces that kind of behavior, which for Hamlet we could call it a manic disposition. But it's interesting that you've locked in on this as something that is perhaps not a good thing, obviously, to be suffering from these ailments, but as a way that let me pose this as a question to you, I guess. Do you think that there is value in that theatricality for the person experiencing the psychotic episode themselves as a form of expression, perhaps?
yeah, absolutely. I think, um, you know, to the doctors who treat them and to the general public, I think a lot of that externalizing can seem a little nonsensical. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of doctors. Maybe there are lots of doctors out there who do put the work in to try and understand the cryptic messages that an ill person is articulating with such theatricality and such expressiveness. But from my memories of being very sick, I had an internal logic to my articulations. Does
Mhm.
that make sense? Like within me, internally, I had reasons for saying everything I said. I had an understanding of the universe, which maybe was unconventional, maybe was delusional, maybe was problematic, maybe wasn't grounded in truth or reality. But I had some internal world which made sense to me when I was sick. And by speaking, by expressing, by sharing, by dramatizing, I'm attempting to to let others around me under try and understand my internal world. And I think the big crisis with people undergoing psychosis who are lost in these delusions and lost in these monologues is that they cannot be understood. And I don't mean to be all like airy fairy about this. I don't have any scientific backing to articulate or to explain what I'm trying to explain here. But like, there is something really interesting that happens internally when someone is going through psychosis,
Mhm.
and the best way for me to describe it is like access to other dimensions of experience,
Right.
which other people have commented on when they do recreational drugs. Like you experience a different logic or a different sort of. It's so hard to articulate. It's
No, it's
really, really
good.
hard. So all I'm saying is like by sharing, by speaking, by expressing, there's an attempt to be understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It also calls to my mind a play that perhaps you're familiar with. It's okay if you're not. Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill. I don't know. Is that a play you've encountered
Never
before?
heard the title, but I've
Yeah.
never.
Well, it's because, okay, long story of that play. Don't need to get into all of it, but one of the main characters, Mary Tyrone, is suffering from an addiction to some kind of narcotic. I think it's morphine specifically, but it's been a while since I've read the play. And the climax of it is that she does kind of enter this state where she can no longer relate to the world around her. She thinks she's in the past. She's living an earlier version of her life. And there's, yeah, the language that the other characters use in their attempt to subdue and contain her is very much likening, as at least as far as my analysis of the play goes, likening the state she's in with a type of theater, and specifically the morphine that she's consumed, which they refer to as poison, because it certainly does. That's the effect it does have on her, is this kind of theatrical drug. And so many of the characters, one of her husband had this career as an actor and that kind of ruined him for various other reasons. So this likening of the psychosis to the theater to the poison, and this sort of triangle of how these things all kind of meld together at the end, and what is a very striking moment in theater history. And anytime it's staged today, it really does, yes, gets gasps from the audience. Let's talk actually a bit about the staging of the play within the play itself. It's something that I kind of find is just like a little interesting, and there's so much like downtime in like what I would call the first two acts of the film, of like characters, like they're painting in the water, they're going for a swim, they're doing small chores. And I'm like, why aren't you rehearsing? The play's tomorrow night. Like, and then the one time they have a rehearsal scene, an hour into the movie, it gets derailed and they don't wind up having any rehearsal at all. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so stressful as anybody who's done theater. that and we also know that Heaven and Gabby are meeting each other for the first time at the beginning of the movie. So there's no chance that we've had rehearsals prior to this, which I found that very stressful. I don't know if this is a common reaction that people have had watching it.
Yeah, it's funny. Reactions to the film that I've received from people within the theater community, I have more questions from the people in the theater community. I mean, I'm writing this movie from the perspective of someone who hasn't really done theater in like 10 years. So it's not that I don't know anything about theater. It's like, I just haven't done theater in 10
That's
years.
Fine.
So it's so funny, like the questions that I get from people who are very familiar with theater, who put on lots of plays. They are also very stressed out by the lack of rehearsal.
And just how lackadaisical they are about it.
Yeah, they're just really chilled out about the rehearsal. In my director's mind, or in my writer's mind, there maybe was some rehearsing that just wasn't caught.
We just don't get to see. Okay,
like,
that's a relief.
maybe they kind of went over the whole thing on day one, and it just wasn't caught on camera.
Sure. I'd like to think so, because they do pull the play together, and like they have good rhythm with each other as actors. Like, it doesn't seem like it had no rehearsal, and I'm sure to peel behind the curtain, you must have rehearsed it many times for the actual filming of it.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah, we rehearsed a lot, and Chelsea Preston brought a lot of ideas. I just want to put that out there. Chelsea Preston played as Roxy Hart in Chicago. Of experience with theater, so just want to say Chelsea was and Tyson's wonderful too, but Chelsea really like drove that.
Chelsea brought the theater mind to the proceedings.
I'm indebted to Chelsea for their ideas and their energy going into the play. But we did rehearse a fair bit for the play, but the lack of rehearsal in the film it's just a quirky, funny little part of our film that maybe is not that realistic, but
well, and that's I'm not trying to harp on that or be like, why didn't you put more rehearsal in the movie? But that
I love the comments from my theater friends, because
I couldn't not bring it up.
They also have that same sense of panic, and I'm like, oh, maybe next time I do a theater film, maybe I should do some more consulting with my theater friends.
So let's talk a bit about the Rapunzel play itself. I'm curious about the writing of this, and that's twofold, because it's both you as the screenwriter who came up with this as the play within the film, but also it is authored by the character of Leah within the movie. And I'm curious how you manage that tightrope of writing this as a compelling piece of drama in its own right that is being staged by the Distillery District Theater Company, I think you call the movie. So not Soul Pepper, but but basically Soul Pepper. And yeah, and she's framed as like an up and coming playwright. So how did you go about writing? What would this young playwright? What would her project be? What does it tell us about her as a character within this movie, but also as the kind of piece of art she would be putting out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, the play, there were certain stresses that came with the writing of the play. One was, again, as someone who hasn't done
Mhm.
proper theater in 10 years, it was hard to sort of think of a story that could play out in 10 minutes,
Mhm.
because you can't really tell a whole story in 10 minutes. So realize it sort of has to be an excerpt of a play, not a
Yeah.
real, the final scene of a
Mhm.
play. And the other big question that I had going into this, well, it sort of came out through the rehearsal process, is like, what kind of play is this? Is this supposed to be a really good play? Or is this supposed to be a comically bad play?
That was a
Well,
thought I had watching it, and because we have this interesting Kuleshov effect of cutting back and forth between the staging of the play and the various members of this 8-person audience watching it, including the writer herself and her reaction. And she's often mouthing along with the lines, as all good writers do when they see their work being staged there. And we have the character Miss Holly Banks in the audience, and her reactions are very telling. She's framed as the artistic director of the Stratford Festival, and it's all being done for her benefit, and we hope she likes it. And
yeah.
it seems like she's into it until the moment when Kevin goes off script, or actually, well, arguably follows the advice that he was given to do something bold and unexpected, and he goes for it, and adds a not properly handled bit of intimacy into the scene. And that, as I kind of view this framing, the cinematic apparatus that you've applied to it, that's the moment where we lose Miss Banks. Is that kind of how you see it? Or yeah, I'm curious how you view the quality and where that tipping point kind of is.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I don't feel in any position to be able to determine what is good theater, what is bad theater, because I don't think I consume enough theater
Mhm.
to be that arbiter of quality, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So I think for a sophisticated theater critic, they would look at this play and be like, maybe this writer is not the best writer of all time, but she's also not comically the worst,
Mhm.
right?
Okay.
Like, there could have been a version of this play that was horrifically amateurish and horribly terrible, right?
Mhm.
And I don't think this play is horribly terrible. We had to write it, like, I had to write it in a way where we could understand why some critic somewhere would have believed that Leah might have some talent, which is
Right.
the review that we
Yeah.
get off the top, is that somebody somewhere thinks that she's pretty good. Do I think the play is wonderful? I don't think it's the best play of all time. I definitely don't think that. We lose Miss Banks, the artistic director of the Stratford Festival, during the unplanned intimacy moments. Me, as Rebecca, as director, as writer of Fortescue, sees those moments as moments of sexual violence.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think Holly Banks sees those as sexual violence because she doesn't know that it's
Right.
unscripted, but she might just think it's a bit over the top
Yeah.
and unnecessary. So that's where we lose her. In my mind, Holly Banks may have thought this little play was kind of cute,
Mhm.
but
She's just coming by in her canoe. Sure, I'll watch a play tonight while I'm
sure,
already at
watch
my
a play
cottage.
tonight. Yeah, why not? I've got nothing to do tonight, or I'll come check it out. But maybe she's got an important phone call to make at home, or she just doesn't want to stay for a little chit chat. She wasn't totally blown away. So she's kind of got other things to do at home. So, maybe she'll write an email.
Okay, I like how you've mapped out in your mind the unofficial sequel in which she's like, "Yeah, I'll follow up about that. This
Yeah,
writer
maybe,
has some promise."
maybe she'll write a little email, but like, she wasn't like, wow, I'm going to put down like
Yeah.
$100,000 on this writer director. No.
There.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to talk a bit about Sonnet 116. Because that's, and well, we can also kind of loop this into that same conversation about the song that appears in the play that clearly affected an audience, as you just described earlier. Yeah, I was really struck out by the appearance of the poem written by Dr. Eliot's father, which I thought for sure, because his name is Ezra Eliot, which sounds like a portmanteau of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. I thought for sure his father was going to be T.S. Eliot, and that the poem would be, April is the cruelest month, and he was going to go into reciting The Wasteland or something. But no, he instantly starts reciting Shakespeare's Sonnet 116. Why was that a piece of writing that you chose to include within the play, within the film?
First of all, I just want to say Ezra Eliot. Those are two of my favorite names of all time, and I do love Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. So you're not wrong in sort of making that connection. But with that sonnet, it's funny. I wrote that sonnet in because it connects with. I'm not able to quote it. I can't quote it for you.
Neither can I. The ever fixed mark is the word that kind of stuck out to me. Like I know that sequence of words, but yeah,
and something that survives tempests.
Yeah,
I don't have the exact wording off the top of my head, but it's a strong statement about love, and the version of love that we're presented with off the top of Rapunzel is the sort of classical, oh, woman in a tower, a man comes to save her. It's the type of romantic narrative that was imposed on me over and over and over again as a young person, as a kid, as a teenager. I watched a lot of romantic movies from the 1950s. I read a lot of, fairy tales and folk tales. And it's a kind of love that young girls hear about, and they're like, oh, this is what love is. Love is being saved by a man. But the type of love that is expressed in that sonnet by Shakespeare is the type of love that Gabby offers. It's the type of love like, I will be there for you whatever happens. I am that solid rock that you can depend on, and I will weather the storm with you. Right? It's a type of love that we again, this relates to notions of relationship anarchy, right? We're taught that our romantic partner is the only person who will offer us that kind of love. But the truth of love is that that kind of love, that kind of like, I will be here for you no matter what, it can surface in all kinds of different dynamics. And it doesn't have to be your romantic partner. And sometimes your romantic partner will totally fail you and will bail and will not offer that kind of love.
Yeah, it's a very good articulation of what that poem expresses on its own terms, but then putting it in this context feels. I wonder, is that a connection that Leah makes with it? Because I feel like that's you, Rebeccah, talking from like a scoped out view of what the film is about, but it doesn't seem to me like her play comes to that same conclusion.
No. Leah's lost in a delusion, is lost in the like 5-year-old I love Disney princesses delusion of a man is going to come save her. So when she's writing that sonnet, she's writing.
She's misreading it.
She is misreading it, and she is writing about Dr. Ezra Eliot as an ideal of heterosexual, like that is the kind of love that matters in this world.
And she has a very interesting line at the very beginning of the film when she's talking with Gabby about losing her relationship to religion as she grew older, and that Kevin rekindles that feeling with her. I think I wrote down the quote, I miss that feeling of warmth that going to church used to give her, and now she gets it with him. So, and I think it's also interesting in relation to what you mentioned earlier about theater and theatrical experiences and going to a cinema has for you replaced that feeling of what church and religious institutions used to offer. I'm trying to form this into a question perhaps, but I think that's an interesting triad of ideas, religion, romantic partnerships and art, and specifically ritualistic arts like theater. Do you care to comment on how those three things intersect in this way?
I have not made this connection, but I think it's a very beautiful connection and very insightful. I grew up in the church. I grew up in the Anglican church, and much like Leah, I felt so loved by my church community and felt warmth and felt safe. And it's hard to feel that kind of safety as an adult, especially and looking at American headlines, thinking about the future of AI and tech, living with illnesses, looking about like the financial realities of being an artist. There are lots of stresses that make it impossible to feel that kind of warmth and safety. I've never really stopped to think that maybe art is the thing, is that like that thing that holds me, or that provides that kind of warmth and safety. But it's a very insightful, beautiful observation, because there's definitely some truth to that when I think about what is it that makes me feel safe and warm.
Well, I think this very elegantly gets us into the next macro topic that I want to talk about. So that was all the theater and metatheatricality, but let's shift slightly into the relationship between art and the self, because I think that's something, it's one of the more subtle themes here. And it's kind of interesting to be kind of getting into this before we get into things like the female friendship and the mental illness too closely. We will get to those, of course. But I thought this was an interesting through line that carried through. And I think it dovetails nicely off of the theater itself, because that is one of the primary art forms that the characters engage in. But we also have things like painting and whatnot throughout this. I kind of just want to talk about, do you feel like not to necessarily appeal to your authorial intent as the be all and end all of what the film is about, but how is this a theme you thought about actively in your writing and directing of this film?
No.
Not at all. Okay, because to me it felt like a very potent through line. And specifically, I'm thinking, again, we're very post spoiler right now, so I'm going to talk about literally the last shot of the film is the hanging up of the painting that Gabby's been doing periodically this whole time. And it relates back to an earlier line about Gabby's philosophy of art, that she thinks that it shouldn't be flashy or loud, that art can be quiet or small. It's better to not share it publicly. It can be a private thing for oneself, and it's more honest and expressive that way. And we obviously, it clashes very heavily with Kevin's view of art, is that I'm too handsome to be a lawyer, I should be on stage. But it's a clear contrast that's being drawn there between the two of them in their worldviews. But then, yeah, I think this is a very, lovely, quiet film that I would say goes to bat for Gabby's view of art over any others. And in that final moment of when Gabby has finished her painting, just hanging it for themselves in the cottage is that note that you leave us on, that you send us home with. And yeah.
Yeah, well, these are such rich, interesting observations. Just to clarify, it's Leah who's hanging Gabby's painting.
Yes.
It's not hanging.
Okay, sorry, did I say it was? I knew it was Leah, but it is.
Yeah,
it is Gabby's painting that is being hung at the end. Yes.
And it's interesting that you contrast Gabby and Kevin when it comes to artistic philosophies, because the contrast I was thinking of making is between Leah and Gabby, where Leah's being written about in a national publication. Right. And is putting on her play in the distillery and is getting the artistic director of Stratford to come see her work, whereas Gabby won't show her work publicly and won't be very loud about her accomplishments, and is more focused on art as a personal endeavor and not as like not trying to be flashy. But it's interesting because it's an interesting remark you're making. Kevin also definitely is like way more sort of flashy and loud than any of them. But that last shot is meant to be about friendship and how important reciprocity is in friendship. Because one thing I'm really self-conscious about in the movie is there's no apology from Leah. Leah behaves very poorly. Leah does not treat Gabby very well. Leah's a bit of an asshole. It's funny because Leah's sort of based on me trying to work through all my shittiest qualities. I'm like, Leah is like really not nice. She's not nice. She accuses Gabby of looking at her boyfriend, and she's really awful to Gabby, talking about, their time in their undergrad and
That
sort of
she's not in the best state. So I think we as the audience can forgive her for a lot of that. We know she's gone off her meds, that she's not being herself.
herself, but she's still pretty aggressive. And one of Gabby's complaints, when Gabby's sitting on the back porch and is pretty upset,
Mhm.
Gabby says Leah is doing really well in her art form, but she's not really paying a lot of attention to what I'm doing. You
Mhm.
know, there's like this sort of, and I think sometimes when you're in the arts, I think a rule generally is that you should support your friends in their art.
Mhm.
It's important. I've had a girlfriend straight up tell me, like, your short was really bad. It was an awful short. And this was so hurtful to me. And I'm like, I don't think this is a very kind thing to say to your friend. If you don't like your friend's art, I think there's a diplomatic way to deal with it.
Yeah.
If you find it problematic for whatever reason, or if you think the quality is bad, or
Or it's just not your cup of tea. It doesn't have to
not
be
your
an
cup of tea.
objective statement about its quality.
Yeah, but there's a way to handle that doesn't mean you're straight up telling your friend you made bad art.
Mhm.
Because this one short that I made, it took like a year and a half to make. And I
Mhm.
just think that's like poor behavior,
Yeah.
And there've definitely been instances in my life where I probably haven't supported my friends in the way that I needed to. One of my biggest shortcomings is I'm very self-absorbed, right? I'm very self-absorbed. And this is what I'm focusing on in Fortescue, is like, what
Mhm.
does it look like to be a self-absorbed storyteller? You're so obsessed with your own story, with your own narratives, with your own art, that sometimes you forget, like, oh, I have a lot of other friends who are making really incredible art, who are
Mhm.
putting themselves out there, and I need to support them. A lot of them are supporting me. I need to support them. Like, it's just sort of like friendship has to be reciprocal. You can't, like, yeah. And maybe you're
Mhm.
familiar with this, the world of theater,
Mhm.
like, going to your friends' shows or supporting your friends in whatever way. But friendships you need to support your friends.
Mhm.
Like, and if, yeah, you need to find ways to do it. At the end, Fortescue, the last shot is Leah hanging up Gabby's painting. Originally, the scene was going to be Leah going to a gallery and trying to get the gallery owner to put on a show for Gabby, right? That was the
Mhm.
dream. That's what I wanted to write. But budget restraints, we just didn't have the time or the money to go off to a gallery and to film this scene. So instead, it's a very simple little gesture. It's very simple, but I think the act of hanging your friend's art on your wall is an act of support. It's
Yeah.
like, I care about you. I want to support your art. Yeah.
Well, that's so interesting. Actually, hearing that a budget constraint fundamentally changed the theme from its original intended to, because if we're talking about these dueling philosophies of art that undergird so much of the discussion, if Leah takes it to the gallery and be like, my friend needs to be seen by a large public and appreciated for her work, that would be her imposing her own philosophy of art on Gabby. And maybe Gabby would appreciate that. She does have the line that she says to Kevin on the porch about how, I have my small accomplishments too. Like, she might be very flattered by that, but there is something I think very beautiful about you made this art for yourself. You
Yeah.
made it quietly. You made it not to make a big splash in the art world. And what better monument for it than hanging it up on our wall? And because Leah is the one who does the hanging, and thank you for correcting that if I misspoke about it earlier, that yeah, it is her embracing Gabby's philosophy rather than imposing her own upon Gabby. So much of this film, like the beauty of it, comes in these quiet bookending sequences of the two of them just having their lovely friendship together. We'll talk more about that in a minute.
Yeah.
But like the quiet way you behave when you are unobserved by the world, the fun they have together, and it's when other parties come and disrupt it that things tend to go awry in
Yeah.
this way. So yeah, like I think it's such a lovely image to end on, and why I kind of phrase this theme that I want to talk about as the relationship between art and self. And you've kind of alluded to this a lot. Is you you make no bones about the fact that there is an autobiographical undercurrent to not just the film as a whole, but specifically the character of Leah. And as the way that she relates to her art. And of course, since she deals with many of the same mental health issues as you, that it's understandable that there is a conversation about autobiography that happens in the film. The character of Noah brings up the idea of, like, I hate the art that Leah makes. I can't watch it because she's so absorbed with herself that she doesn't pay any attention to the world around her. And I think that that's also kind of, it's interestingly related to another conversation around art that might feel separate, but I think it's very interconnected about the privilege to be an artist and the who has more privilege than others, the ones who have money and are able to kind of just walk into the art world and have their pieces received because of their parents' connections, or the people who are privileged with adequate health and that they're able to. And like I something I admire about it is that you don't provide like a right or wrong answer, that these are two rights, that neither of them is wrong, and that's where the tension in this argument comes from. And I feel like I'm rambling a bit. This is me like reviewing your film to you, and you tell me if I did a good job of it. But I also think another area where autobiography comes up is specifically in the Rapunzel play, where even after, when Kevin brings up the reason why I did this act of sexual aggression in the play is because I'm trying to make it more truthful to your life. The Dr. Elliot climbing through the window is just like all your suitors when you were in undergrad, and I bet they did a lot more than read poetry and drink tea. So, and he has the line, I think I wrote it down here, that isn't it better to be more truthful or true to life? And it's an interesting way to him justifying his behavior, but I'm curious about, I guess I bring up all of these isolated incidents that I think do amalgamate into a thematic through line here to say that how we make art and how our art reflects aspects of ourselves and who we are as people is a defining and driving factor of the art we make, and what art means to us, I think, is a big part of what this film, whether intentional or not, ultimately becomes about. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that.
Sure. Yeah. So I do a lot of writing. I live with a few different diseases. Bipolar is a mental health condition, but I also live with some physical health conditions. And I have, especially in the past like 10 years, I've gotten in the habit of doing a lot of writing over Instagram about my life. And it's a coping mechanism for physical pain and emotional pain. It's a way to process what I've gone through. So Fortescue is, it is not straight autobiography. It is not.
Yes, and I wouldn't claim that it was, just because there's clear influences from your own life.
Yes,
want to clarify that? Yes.
No, of course, and I'm not accusing you of making this statement like that, but it's not like pure like reenactment of like true events that I went through. But there is a ton of me trying to make sense of myself in this movie. The clearest example is the Rapunzel play, where I am trying to make sense of how lonely it can be living with illness. In the Rapunzel play, there's reference to psychosis, but there's also reference to physical pain. A cough. She's caught the plague. There's a slight reference to joint pain, which should come out of nowhere because Leah apparently doesn't have joint pain, but I have joint pain.
Yeah.
I have a ton of physical pain, a ton of emotional pain. I've spent hours and hours and hours in bed. Like, I have spent so much time alone in hospitals, in doctor's appointments, in surgeries, in like having a pneumonia. Like, I've just had so much illness. And that's the biggest thing that I think I'm processing in the Rapunzel scene, especially the opening monologue of the Rapunzel scene, just how lonely it is being really sick. It's so lonely, and you're not supposed to complain about it, because if you become a complainer, no one wants to hang out with you if you're just like, my illnesses, but this play is an opportunity for me to just be like, yeah, it really fucking sucks. There's a little bit of reference to like not being a mother, and that's something I've struggled with a lot, like motherhood and illness, but just like being alone. She's alone in her tower. She's like coughing and she's like, thinks she's dying. That is a lot of my experience just sort of dramatized. And I think the play within the play allows me to explore a lot of my emotional interior that I wouldn't be able to explore these things in the realism of the rest of the film. So there's a lot of that. On top of that layer, there's the self-consciousness of the privileges that I do live with. So half of my life is full of a lot of difficulty and pain. I'm crippled. I can't walk very well. I get pneumonias and coughs all the time. Again, I have so much like shit happening on that side of things. But I do live with other privileges, obviously. And it's like a complex sort of emotional interior I live with because I have been offered opportunities to make my art. And a lot of that is tied into privilege and certain types of privileges that I was born into. But I'm hyper aware of that and like almost neurotic about it, where I'm like, "Ugh, no one's going to like this film because Leah is so snotty and overprivileged and unpleasant and arrogant and self-absorbed and like what a horrible protagonist." I adore Kelty Falconer, who portrays the character, and she did such a beautiful job, and I'm really, really grateful to her energy. But like the character itself is like, oh, so problematic and like not a very pleasant person to spend a lot of time with. So, anyways, in the film, there are all these like subtle little moments where I am like pretty clearly inserting myself in an exploration of my pain, but then also coming in with like a little bit of like neurotic self-criticism or anxiety about myself. It's probably unpleasant as well in its own way. Like, I don't know, but like, yeah, I have so much of me in there. It's not pure me, but it's like there's a lot of my own, like I'm just trying to figure myself out or like trying to like process my own shortcomings or my own shittiest qualities and sort of display them for public, being like, this is what I'm kind of like sometimes. Like, ooh, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. And like, it's interesting how you talk about the things you don't like about yourself, and then you have all of this self-critique in there by virtue of the fact that, yeah, maybe Leah isn't always the best behaved person, and we feel like, she does have all this privilege, even if she's has issues in other ways. But then the other characters are constantly kind of knocking her down a peg and having their sort of insightful critiques about that. And I do think that, yeah, where else but in the artistic domain can you represent yourself so vulnerably while also critiquing yourself? And I think great drama is built around these types of arguments where, the characters come into conflict with each other because they have opposing views about these things. And, you need to, I think you have done an excellent job of stepping out of yourself while still using this as a vehicle for that interior expression.
Thank you. Thanks.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's just so interesting, the very things you grappled with about your relationship between yourself and your art in making it has itself become the theme of the film, that is what the characters spend so much time meditating and musing upon in their various artistic endeavors.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly, yeah. I wrote it all into her, and then she's writing it all into Gabby, and it's sort of funny the layers of autobiography, because Gabby is carrying all of Leah's pain, and Leah is carrying all of my pain. So it's sort of like this layering of
Mhm.
pain and expression of autobiography that was really fun to it was so fun engaging with Kelsey and Chelsea over these questions, because they are both very, very insightful. They're wonderful actors, and they brought their own ideas to how this layering should be manifested in their performances.
Well, speaking of these kind of interesting debates that happen within the film, I think this is a good way to move on to the next theme that I want to talk about. And we've already addressed it in many ways because they're also intertwined, but mental illness in particular. You mentioned how in your breakdown of what the title means, how, and it's a very insightful way of putting it, that this film dramatizes three different reactions to somebody having a mental breakdown. And the one that I feel like gets, I don't want to say the least credit, but has certainly the least amount of screen time, is Noah's reaction, which I find, he's a very fascinating character to me because he he is at once the most and least sympathetic character. Because on one hand, he's the voice of saying, like, there's nothing embarrassing about you were sick, you had to leave school for that reason, you shouldn't be so hard on yourself. And yet he's also the hardest on her. He says, like, she's just going crazy, there's no other way to put it, I can't even, like, he seems so unempathetic. and
Yeah.
in one moment, but then very empathetic in another. And I find that bundle of contradictions embodied by that character very fascinating. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that.
Yeah. I mean, like, when it comes to Noah, I am very sympathetic for people who need to put that boundary up and who need to leave.
Mm-hmm.
That I understand. Some people don't have the bandwidth. They don't have the capacity to deal with a psychotic break and they just need to get out of there. That I understand. I think some of his comments at the dinner table, do you know, like people who go to therapy and they learn this therapy speak and they perform a version of themselves,
Right.
which is meant to be more likable and more like that's kind of what I see it happening at the dinner table when he's just trying to be pleasant. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I have issues with Noah's behavior, like sharing the fact that he shares that she has manic depression,
Mm-hmm.
which is you're not supposed to do. You should never, ever, ever reveal anyone's
Yeah.
medical. As someone who
Yes.
lives with like so many medical conditions, you should never talk
It's not.
about
Yeah. It's not
medical
your
conditions.
place to out somebody's condition.
Never. It's
Yeah.
a version of outing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like you just don't do that. But he doesn't just out her about her manic depression. He outs her about her
Yeah.
history of
Yeah.
promiscuity, right? It's like,
Yes, which we'll talk about that too, because that's another
yeah,
topic that I think is very,
right.
very interesting.
So his behavior, the fact that he says, "Oh, you shouldn't be self-conscious about your manic depression." For me, that doesn't suggest that he's a great person. He's
Mhm.
just trying to be nice. But his behavior is like I don't mind him leaving. I don't mind that. That doesn't bother me. But I mind him outing her twice.
Yeah.
That I have a lot of problems with. And some people don't understand those rules, especially when they're drinking. I
Mhm.
think when people drink, they can forget about certain rules. I've seen this before. It's like it's really important not to talk about people's health issues ever.
Mhm.
Yeah, for me, I feel strongly about that. So there's some things I can understand about Noah, but when he does that at the table, I'm like, that's just so unacceptable. But yeah.
Yeah. But I think there's also an element of yeah, as I read the performances between these actors as you've directed them and edited them together in the final film, I get the sense that he's definitely intimidated by Kevin, and I feel like he's uncomfortable with Kevin's relationship to Leah. He repeatedly says that he loves Leah, and even though I would argue that the character is queer coded on some level, it's unclear perhaps what kind of queer he is, and when he says he loves her, what does he mean by that, and to what extent is it love in a platonic friendship sense, and to what extent might there be a romantic rivalry that he is feeling in his relationship and how he relates to the character of Kevin. I also feel like so much of the queer coding is very much presented through his fashion and like there's the moment with his fingernails that you expertly draw attention to. Otherwise, they perhaps could have even like gone completely unnoticed.
Mm.
I don't know. Am I picking up on something here that you thought through, or
I
am I
guess
reading too much into it?
we had certain conversations about who Noah is and who he might be attracted to, but it's a very open. I certainly don't have firm opinions about. I'm open to lots of different interpretations. Like we did have a lot of conversations about his backstory and his connection with Leah. Yeah, I'll watch the film a
With
number
the
of times and I'll sort of see different things depending on what I'm watching.
Okay, yeah, I have more thoughts too, but maybe we'll sidebar about those off because we are going long here, and there's more themes I do want to get to. But to stay within the realm of the mental illness here, so because that's the context in which I brought this up, yeah, I would say, like, first and foremost, this might be like the main thing that the movie is about in a lot of ways. And we've talked about how theater is an expression of that, how your relationship to yourself through art is a way of processing a lot of this. Let's just talk about the kind of arc of this is a film that is about one person's process of slowly having a breakdown. We're presented to the fact that she's used up the last of her meds, so she has gone off it at this point. She's in a very stressful situation, surrounded by people who either don't understand or aren't sympathetic to what she's going through, not able to get themselves in her state of mind, dealing with their own issues. And over the course of it, and obviously Kelsey does an excellent job manifesting this in her performance, but yeah, we see that hitting that wall to the climactic moment in which she personifies the Virgin Mary.
Mm.
Yeah, well, what are your thoughts on how this arc of the breakdown is portrayed in the film?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really challenging. I've done psychosis in shorts before, but psychosis in a feature. This was brand new for me. This was my first feature. It's hard to write and it's hard to perform and to direct performance. With the writing, it's sort of hard because psychosis doesn't necessarily occur in gradations of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, with 1 being healthy and 10 being really sick. It sort of comes in little waves, I think, and it's hard to find the right types of situations that clearly indicate illness arriving. And then Kelsey was such a pro in our conversations and our rehearsals. Shooting out of order is very stressful because for Kelsey, especially because one moment she's at 9 and the next moment she's at 1 and the next moment she's at 4 and the next moment she's at 9.
Mm-hmm.
Psychosis is a trauma. It's a trauma to perform. It's like you have to be really careful about entering into that headspace and then exiting it and then entering it again and then exiting it again. It's a trauma. Like the mind can't tell the difference between actual illness and performance. So writing, it was hard. Performing and directing performance, that was really hard. Did we get it perfect? I'm not sure. I mean, like it's a stylized version of psychosis. Real psychosis is a lot more disturbing than what we depicted. And also recovering from psychosis is like a 10-month process.
Yeah, which you use a montage to compress that time very strategically.
Yeah. And originally, again, the budgetary constraints affecting narrative. Originally, we were going to go to a hospital, but I didn't want, like, we just didn't have the time to like leave location and to like get the permits we just didn't have the time. So originally we didn't have that line about the lithium.
Okay, that was a fix for the how does she stabilize so quickly?
Right, because without that line, the thesis is that friendship fixes
Right.
which we all know is not how it works, right? Like you need
Yeah.
meds back in your system in order to feel stable. So yeah, anyways, like if you were to show this to doctors, to psychiatrists, I'm sure they'd take issue with a lot of different things that happen in our film. But thank goodness it's not it's not a documentary. It's not supposed to be super realistic. It's a narrative. It's a bit of a fantasy. It's a bit of a fantasy world. For one thing, the girls spend so much time just hanging out at their cottage. Sometimes I'm like, how long are they up there? Like 3 weeks before the movie starts? Like, who's got the time to spend 3 weeks? Oh my gosh. Anyways, this is the fantasy element. To answer your question, yeah, the psychosis, it takes place over the course of the film. It was challenging. It's challenging to write, challenging to perform, challenging to direct.
Yeah. What would you say? Like, not that you have to necessarily package it into a thesis, but I think like there is an argument being made about mental illness throughout this film, and I think you prefaced it earlier about these 3 different reactions that other characters have to it, but not everybody has experiences with these kind of psychoses. They don't necessarily have relationships with friends or family members who've allowed them to unfortunately have to see it firsthand or had it themselves. So not that the film has to be educational by any means, but what would you say is the takeaway of this theme that you hope some people might bring with them after they leave the film?
There are like a few different things. One, the big one is like, try to be empathetic and patient with the people in your life who have complex mental illness. Because I think the impulse is to leave or to attack. And there's some instances, like the big thing I really want to state before I like dive into this is that psychosis can be dangerous. It can be dangerous. And sometimes the best thing to do is to call 911. And sometimes you do need to apply force to someone who's unwell. Like it can be a dangerous condition. But a lot of the times it's not. And a lot of the times, all that's needed is a little patience and empathy. So obviously, your safety is the most important thing if you're ever dealing with a person living with psychosis in an episode. But a lot of people are just like having the worst day of their life when they're in a psychotic break and need patience and empathy. So with the sort of the way I frame it is like one person leaves, one person attacks, and one person has that like lovely compassion. The point I'm making is like, if you are patient and empathetic with the people in your life who have complex mental illness, like that is a beautiful way to be. That's a big point I'm making. Another point I'm making has less to do with mental illness and more to do with like misogyny. And it relates again to this idea that like women forever have been told that a man is going to give you that peace and strength and love and is going to be your rock and is going to be your strong shield. I guess one of the messages of the film is that, you know, other people can fulfill that role for you. Maybe it's going to be a man, maybe it's going to be your husband, maybe it's going to be your boyfriend, but maybe it's going to be your best friend, or maybe it's going to be a neighbor, or maybe it's going to be your roommate, or, you know, like there are lots of different people who can kind of hold you, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that like romantic sexual partner that you're having. I guess those are kind of like the two big messages. The loneliness of illness is like, it's touched on briefly in the Rapunzel play, but it's something that means a lot to me, is that how lonely it can be to live with diseases. It's not really touched on that much in the rest of the film, but it's just something that like I read when I'm watching the film.
This gets us to the last two topics that I wanted to bring up pretty well, which are the female sexuality as a prominent theme and female friendship. And then we can maybe even talk about these two together, because I do think they definitely go hand in hand. Sure. And why I maybe segment out female sexuality as its own category, at least initially, is because, yeah, that is an interesting through line. Each one of these that I isolate as a theme is because I do see a through line that you could watch the entire film through the lens of just focusing on this, and you get a complete story in its own right. Okay. And female sexuality is a very interesting one, from as early as the first post-montage conversation when Gabby and Leah are talking about their relationship to religion and church. She mentions that she gave a blowjob to a guy from Hamilton and no longer felt like she could go into that sacred space, and that was her break from religion. And it is only through her relationship with Kevin, another explicitly sexual relationship, that she has found that wholeness within herself again, at least so she thinks at that moment. So you're almost presenting a thesis, not necessarily the final thesis of the film, but a thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of dialectic that as early as that beginning. And sexuality comes up so often, and the way that you used the term female gaze versus male gaze earlier, I forget which one you specifically harped on, but being under the scrutiny of the male gaze, I think, is an interesting way that Kevin's role in this shapes out. There, I think about the conversation about Degas and the young ballerinas, and how he has this complex approach to this teenage girl that he sees very often. And it's, you know, it's icky for a lot of reasons for a lot of these, but the way I read it, and you could perhaps have a different view of it yourself, but I see it very much as he just gets off on being desired and having people find him desirable. I don't think he ever intended to do anything inappropriate with this teenage girl, but, you know, maybe you have other ideas about this. But where I think all of this kind of comes to a boil is specifically in relation to the reaction of disgust that he feels towards Leah's sexual history as it comes out in that night of drinking around the table, as you've alluded to earlier. And this contrast that exists in Leah's mind about how he wants someone virginal. That's why he liked the Degas ballerinas, not realizing that they were in fact sex workers. Then that element of innocence is something created by the male artist and not the actual history that is being dramatized within that artwork. Why he keeps sort of, I don't want to say pining after, but keeps this sort of dance with this young girl that Leah observes through her binoculars from a distance while he's on the boat. And then this culminates in her wanting to be the Virgin Mary, or at least seeing herself as that. And she explicitly says in there that this is what Kevin wants. So she's even in, when she's dissociated from reality, there is still this conscious element of, this is the thing I need to be because this is what he wants. These are the expectations that men and patriarchy and male society demand of women. And like, she also brings up the line then about how young do you think those ballerinas were? And yeah, there is a story there, a story within the story about, before we even get too far into female friendship, as I would argue the antidote to that, I think there is a complete beginning, middle, and end to the conversation around female sexuality and the punishment thereof that you've told in this piece. Care to comment?
Sure. Yeah, let's dive in. So first I want to just mention Tyson Cody plays Kevin, and I think he does a wonderful job. And he is like nothing like his character. He
I
is
would hope not. I don't think you'd want to work with someone
thoughtful,
like Kevin.
passionate, and he's great. I really enjoy working with him. The film touches a lot on female sexuality. I mean, it starts with their clothing. If you notice in the opening montage and the closing montage, they are wearing colorful, weird, bright, whimsical, like Value Village chic, just like funny hats and like costume jewelry. Like it's like they're like 7-year-olds playing dress up, right? That's the vibe. And they do not care about being sexy. They do not care about wearing fitted clothing. They do not care about looking cool. Like they are just in their element. They're playful. They're having fun. They look like, I don't know, like whimsical kindergarten teachers. And then as soon as Kevin arrives, they start wearing clothing from Aritzia, which is the tight, they're showing off their bodies. Their color palette is more neutral colors. They're trying to be cool. They're trying to be elegant. They're trying to look hot. They're trying to like show off their bodies. And this is like the first thing about female sexuality, trying to look attractive for men, which is something that some of my girlfriends are still in this headspace. 15 years ago, it was so bad. It was so bad. We all neglected our own like personal styles, and we all started wanting to like just look really sexy. So it's just something I've noticed about women, the way we engage with men, or at least when we were younger, the way we would change essentially like the essence of who we were just to get male attention. So that's the first point about female sexuality. There's a lot about the female gaze, male gaze. So male gaze, that's when they start wearing the sexy clothing, but there's also this element of female gaze, of the female, Gabby is sort of interested in Kevin's physique. And I don't think Gabby respects Kevin, but there's an attraction there. There's like a forbidden attraction. When I was an early teenager, like there was a lot of like emphasis on male libido, American Pie movies, and like just dumb, like Will Ferrell movies, like dumb movies about men wanting to get laid, like Girl Next Door, like that kind of stuff. And there was nothing about women's desire, like a girl having the right to have desire. There was like I don't think I ever consumed one movie about a 14 or 15-year-old girl who had desire. And that's frustrating because all 14-year-old girls have desire, but like this idea that we're not allowed to express it, or we're not allowed to act on it, or we have to stay calm so that men come to us. Like we have to be chaste. I don't know. There's just a way of being, especially growing up in the Christian church, right? That like I grew up in the Christian church. That's the next level. It's like women have to be virginal. Like that's like I played the Virgin Mary when I was 11 or 12, the church play. And that is really the messaging that you get when you're 11 or 12. You're like, the Virgin Mary was so perfect because she was a virgin, And anyways, like I obviously live with a lot of anger about all of this. It's patriarchy. It's like the slut shaming of like, I think of girls in my year who were sexually active when they were like 13 or 14. And the shame and the gossip around their sexual acts, instead of the boy who she had hooked up with. Like no one would talk about him ever. They would only talk about her. And like I feel like growing up, I was a 1990 baby, so growing up in the early 2000s was such a misogynistic culture. It was so misogynistic. Anyways, I have a lot of anger about this, so this is part of what I'm processing in the film. In the film, there is a storyline about Leah having a history of sleeping with men in her early 20s, which is like a lot of men slept with a lot of women in their early 20s. I really don't see what the problem is, but Kevin definitely does see it as a problem. And it's been clearly articulated that Kevin sees purity as a beautiful thing. He looks at these paintings of these ballerinas and he sees, again, you're very astute in saying like, well, these ballerinas actually weren't very pure. They were exploited.
But don't give me credit for that. That's Gabby's point in the movie.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. But for him, and some men think this way that women who have no sexual experience or very little sexual experience are more ideal than women who have had many lovers or many partners. And it's funny because like we did a test screening at TIFF last January, and a lot of the men in the audience were like, Kevin is so bad. Like, he's such a bad guy. I don't believe that this guy exists. And a lot of the women who have shared
They're
this,
like, yep, he exists.
like, I've met 100 men like Kevin. Like, he's an archetype that women recognize, but a lot of men only hang out with their awesome guy friends. They have no sense of how many Kevins exist in the world.
And I would
Like,
argue that some of those men who probably said that exact point are probably also a little Kevin more than they would care to
right,
admit, and their
right.
guy friends are too, but
Yeah,
they're not used to the quiet part being said aloud the way that Kevin does, maybe.
there we go. Yeah, exactly that. But in the test screenings, it was suggested to me to cut the teenage girl scenes because they were like, it's too much. It's too much having this awful guy like hit on this teen girl. But for me, I really wanted to dramatize the ballerina archetype.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I wanted the ballerina to come to life, and I wanted to see what she's like in modern day, like in the flesh, what does the ballerina look like today? And that's like what, a 16-year-old girl hanging on her dock in a bikini. For me, that for me communicates Degas ballerinas. That's, there we have her. You know, if it's just on the page, it's sort of an abstraction. It's sort of like but when we see her in the flesh and we see Kevin, it's like, I had some men in my community who read the script. They were like, "What's so bad? He's just winking at a teenage girl. What's the problem with that?" But like, any woman in my community has been there in the position of the 16-year-old girl, and it is really uncomfortable. It's like an uncomfortable feeling. The one we portray is sort of flattered. The teenage girl is a little bit flattered. And some teenage girls are flattered by that kind of weird attention. But when you get older, when you grow older, when you're in your 30s, you look back and you're like, ugh, that is so awful. Like, there's just like, ah. So it's just like a little bit of hypocrisy that we're pointing out in the character of Kevin. You kind of get the sense that he's probably been around. He's probably slept with lots of women. He's hitting on the 16-year-old girl. He's also kind of hitting on Gabby, like, a little bit.
He likes rough sex too, as we see in that one scene. So that's not something that necessarily just comes out organically from no experience or minimal experience. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's this idea that there are men out there who think that a woman's value is all tied to her inexperience, and how damaging that is for women. Really, it like is really awful. And I think the other thing with the teenage girl, the 16-year-old, like, this is something that I think about a lot. Like, I have my, like, some of the things I struggle with in my own life revolve around like body dysmorphia and eating disorders and conditions and symptoms that sort of like relate to my own physical appearance, and a lot of self-consciousness about what I look like a ton. Part of growing older, you know, I'm now 34, is like, I'm growing further and further away from that ideal woman, which is presented to us over and over again in advertisements of like a 20-year-old, a 19-year-old woman with perfect skin and like slim waist. And, you know, there's like a perfect version of womanhood that women are supposed to look like forever, and we don't look like that forever. We grow older, our bodies change.
As you should.
Yeah, exactly. We put on weight, our skin gets wrinkled, we get cellulite, all these things. As we grow older, we move further and further away from that ideal. And you add illness into the mix, and it's like, it really messes with your head because you're like, wow, I am so far from that ideal. And it's so harmful. And that's another reason why I really wanted that 16-year-old girl there, because there's certain types of men who will always crave that ideal of womanhood, and who will sort of neglect or reject older women because they don't match that like perfect. Anyways, it's really harmful for women. And I think, you know, the idea that your partner would be eyeing a younger woman, it's just so harmful. So anyways, back to your question about sexuality, women's sexuality. There's tons in the movie about a woman's right to sexual expression, about the way women transform themselves to appeal to men, the specific kinds of sexual violence and physical violence that women will receive in their sexual dynamics with men. Yeah, there's just a ton in there. I don't quite have a clear thesis for you.
You don't need to have a thesis,
Okay.
but yes, it's I'm basically just doing good close reading of these are the things I've pulled out from the film, and yeah, it's funny that in the context of an interview, I guess I'm making you feel like you have to be like, yes, that's what it is, and let me tell you about why. But no, I guess we're just having a fun conversation about these are the things I extracted from it.
Yeah, no, I love it.
Yeah, no, thank you for illuminating a lot of this, and I guess to cap off this sequence of 5 themes, if the framing of how these structures of female sexuality are perceived by men and punished and whatnot, I think the ultimate final theme that I've been saving for last here, but we've already addressed it in a few ways, is this female friendship. And I think more than anything, maybe this is what the film is really about. And specifically, as we present, or as you presented, the relationship between Leah and Gabby. And the whole film is bookended, as I said, by these 2 montages. And I love what you broke down about like their costumes and the mise en scène of how they're just like living their best life for themselves, by themselves, without needing to perform. And that, I guess, maybe brings us back to the metatheatricality as well. I love what this film has to say about friendship, and how Gabby in the end is that strong shield who's not the strong male provider that Leah thinks she needs, but is there for her. But there's something that's kind of bugged me a bit. And you're welcome to defend your view of it or your thoughts of it, and maybe you completely agree with what I'm about to say, but I would like to do a bit of a queer reading on Gabby, if we may.
Sure.
Because like in so much of every time I've seen you describe this film, either in other interviews or as you've done here, friendship is the key word, and it certainly is. But I think there is a question that hovers around a lot of this, and I think the filmmaking supports this reading, whether or not it is a definitive reading, that there is a romantic longing that Gabby has for Leah, that she knows, forbidden might be too melodramatic a word for it, but she knows that it's not the case, or that it won't be. There's no reciprocity there, because as far as Leah is presented, she is straight, or at least perceives herself to be straight, that she certainly desires men. And, we can question to what extent Gabby also seems to have some attraction towards Kevin also, and so it doesn't have to be like fully lesbian. I think there's probably an element of bisexuality or pansexuality there, or even just romantic more so than sexual in a lot of these ways. But yeah, we get this kind of big strong line at the end about well, I love you, is what she says in the water, and after she gets over her fear of swimming to save the person she cares most about, and then it just returns us back to the status quo that they had at the beginning of the film. But I also think back of scenes like the sex scene that we talked about earlier between Leah and Kevin, and we cut back to Gabby having to listen to it from the other room, and there is an element of frustration there, and part of it, can be read in a very innocent, very chaste friendship dynamic. I think of the scene of her holding the little frog, "Will you be my friend? Oh no, I'm all alone again," which is very, very cute, that there is this desire for friendship. But I don't know, I feel like there's another element here of longing that transcends friendship alone, that I'm curious, because you so frequently refer to it in the language of female friendship. I wonder, is that partly the tragedy of Gabby, is that she can only have this relationship within a matrix of platonic friendship?
Yeah, and you wouldn't be the first person to have suggested this, and I totally understand your interpretation. My
Mhm.
intentions as a writer and as a director were that Gabby is not attracted to Leah. It's funny, like I spoke with one of my guy friends about this film, and he read the script and he watched the movie, and the specific type of friendship that I'm depicting here doesn't actually exist very often amongst 34-year-olds.
Hmm.
It's kind of inspired by myself now, and it's kind of inspired by myself in my early 20s, especially the parading around for men in like tight dresses. That's very like early 20s.
Mhm.
But a lot of the friendship that I'm depicting is like being an 8-year-old.
Yeah, and that you feel that in those montages for sure.
Yeah, and when I was 8, like, I touched my girlfriends a lot, not in a sexual way, but, like, we would have baths together, we would take showers together, we would give each other massages, we'd play with each other's hair, and it was a specific kind of friendship that was, like, very touchy-feely. My guy friend who watched the film, he was like, "Oh, boys had that too. We would except we'd play soldier or we'd wrestle, and that's how we would touch each other. We would touch each other a lot." It's funny, like when I shared the script with some of my girlfriends, they didn't understand it because they have never had a friendship like this. Even when they were kids or when they were teenagers, they would never have a friendship where you would shower together or give each other a massage. Like that
Mhm.
just didn't exist for them. So they don't have a frame of reference. And the notes they gave me on the script were like, these scenes are unrealistic because that's not what I do with my friends.
My thought is that that's interesting because for me, at no point in the, I'm obviously, my relationship to is going to be different as a man and like, but everything, but I never thought for a moment that friendship that they have seems unrealistic. I just thought
Yeah.
it felt very romantic. In addition to, there is an element of friendship, and all great romances are
Yeah.
built on friendship. But
Yeah.
even just like how close they are, in bed, looking into each other's eyes while talking about their greatest fears, and there is a tenderness is maybe the word I'm looking for, but there's something that
Definitely
feels,
tenderness.
yeah. No, please, sorry, go
Yeah,
on.
I mean, again, like I do not want to shut down anybody who has a theory that Gabby is queer or that Leah is queer or that I think the beauty of a film like this is that people see different things, and I do not want to shut anyone down.
Yeah,
I can just share my own
please.
take.
That's what an
Um,
interview is for.
yeah, and my own take is that it's just a very very close friendship.
Hmm.
A lot of people don't understand that kind of friendship because they have never had that kind of friendship or they only had a friendship like that like 20 years ago. Yeah, for me, like I have definitely have really, really close friends that I do not want to sleep with. I do not want to touch them in any kind of sexual way, but I adore them and I am very close to them. So that's like this movie is based off of like 3 or 4 different friendships. So like it's not straight, you know what I'm saying? It's not like directly
Yeah,
inspired. Like, yeah, there's just like there's a lot of energy that
you take the pieces from your life. Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, I'm delighted by anyone interpreting this film whatever way they want to, and but I'm just yeah, in terms of my intentions as a director, it's supposed to be it's not supposed to be anything. It's supposed to be whatever you want it to be, but in my own take, they do not have any kind of sexual or romantic cravings for one another.
And like I think there is an element of maybe even not explicitly romantic or sexual, but there's an element of, I think, partnership is what they share. And that being what we leave the film on is the man has been ejected from the space, and then they resume the happy status quo they had at the beginning of it just being the two of them living their best lives, not having to think about, the imposition that the male energy brought into the space. I kind of love in that final montage. There's an interesting image that I should be very curious if you did this deliberately, but there's no running water in the cabin at the beginning. And Kevin shows up, big manly man wielding a screwdriver. He gets the water running again in this all female space, if you catch my drift. And then the water shuts down right as tensions are beginning to become irreconcilable in the relationship between Kevin and Leah. And then in that final montage, what is one of the things that the two ladies do together? They get the water running again, if you catch my drift. So, thoughts?
There's no subtext to those.
There is
Like,
subtext. There might not be no text,
sorry,
but
there's no suggestion being made
yes.
by the water starting and stopping except for he didn't do a good job fixing the water, and that's it. Yeah.
It just felt so to be on the nose that it almost didn't seem like it could be an accident but that's interesting to hear. And this is, I think, death of the author, and that you can have as many intentions as you want and the audience will read meaning into it. And if I can actually trace that one simple through line of that image with has a beginning, a middle, and end that represents its own little mini story itself, then yeah, who could say that it's not in the film? I'm not saying that you're saying that. You've been very diplomatic about people's interpretations of what they get from the film, but yeah,
see whatever they want to see. But that wasn't something that was planned or was meant to be a message of any kind yet.
Happy accidents. Okay, well, we've been talking for a long time. Those were all the topics that I did want to address, and this. More than anything, I just want to say that you have made a very compelling piece of art, very thought-provoking, and the fact that we could go on and on about all these different topics about it, that so many things have very interesting setups and payoffs and intertwine with each other. I think you should be very proud of the piece you've created. I hope it receives the reception and audience that you're hoping for across all these film festivals and whatever its afterlife might be beyond.
Bless you. Thank you so much. And what a beautiful, in-depth list of questions you have prepared and thought.
I wish they were questions. These are just my thoughts that I
love that.
I wanted to form them into questions. We're just gonna talk about it.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's clearly you are a person who thinks deeply about storytelling, and I'm really, really delighted. Like, lots of beautiful things for me to think about. So
okay. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. We will end the spoiler section here. Before I let you go, do you have any idea what your next project will be, or are you still completely in this world and can't even begin to entertain or announce if nothing is able to be announced yet?
I have 2 story ideas. One is about a 13-year-old girl as it relates to kind of like sexual assault and patriarchy and government. I don't know, like, those sort of vague little themes there. And then I have another kind of a rough story idea about shipbuilders in New Brunswick in the 1890s. So
that feels like a big pivot from your otherwise very cohesive body of work.
Yeah, it's a little different. Anyways, it's such an undertaking to bring a film to life. It requires this like tidal wave of energy and time and resources and money. And in my mind, you have to be an insane person to make a movie. And luckily for me, I am a certifiably insane person, but it's just like a huge commitment. And it's like, it could take 8 years or 10 years or 5 years, like, whoa, that's a lot of time. We'll see.
Yeah. Now that you have made your first feature, is there any going back to shorts, or do you feel like
I might go back to shorts because it's just
more manageable? Or does the rhythm of your career constantly need to move on to bigger and larger scale, or else you feel like you're backpedaling? I don't know. I'm not trying to put that idea in your head, but it's a worthwhile concern.
They're questions I'm wrestling with. Maybe I'll just become an accountant and give up on storytelling.
Well, I don't think that would be wise, because you clearly have a knack for it, and you would be depriving the world of all your interesting ideas and artistry. But you've put out an interesting body of work already that we will always have that. If you become a reclusive accountant, then the legend will only grow.
Great. Well,
okay.
He's hoping. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there a link where people, if they want to get more information about various stops on this festival tour or about the film, where they can maybe access that information?
Best place to go is Instagram.
Okay.
At Fortescue Film.
Okay. And we'll put that in the description of this episode so people can access it.
So it's at FORTESCUEFILM.
Okay, perfect. So people should follow that. And what about you personally? Would you like to plug your own social media handles or website or anything where people can find you and keep up with your work?
No, I actually am a little bit of a hermit on social media. I don't have public accounts. So
that's perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. I'm with you on that kind of thing. So that's great. So if anybody wants to follow, they just have to follow the film itself.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much, Rebeccah, for joining me for this conversation. This was very nourishing and enlightening, and it's so nice to experience a piece of art, and how often you get to talk to the person who made it in such depth and share all of those thoughts with the world. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for this this beautiful interview. I feel very heard, and I am very grateful for the amount of time and effort you put into watching the film and preparing your thoughts and inviting me onto your show. I feel very, very grateful.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm grateful for having you on here, for being such a generous interlocutor for these thoughts about your work. So I'm wishing you to break a leg with the rest of the festival circuit and with the perhaps wider distribution that the film might get after, and break a leg with all of your future creative endeavors. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have next. And
That's
thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. If you want to keep up with us on social media, it's at COH Theater on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Cup of Hemlock Theater on YouTube, where you might be watching this. Cup of Hemlock Theater podcast and all the podcast places where you might be listening to this. Thank you so much, everyone. This is our first interview of 2025, but there's going to be more coming down the line, as well as many reviews, possibly some editorials, maybe some of our screened plays where we talk more about films, but specifically films that are based on plays, which this operates on an interesting line between. Thank you so much once again, Rebecca. Appreciate having you on the show, and stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you all in the next episode. Cheers.